Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil Revelations 2 survival difficulty, no healing walkthrough. You notice I tried to say no damage, but I'm actually not doing that because this game I don't feel like deserves a no damage walkthrough. And there are just a lot of moments where your AI partner can take a lot of damage, and there's just a lot of situations where it's very easy to take damage when you're separated. And I didn't want to waste time restarting a section over and over again just to satisfy some arbitrary no damage restriction. I mean, in this case, I would consider no damage arbitrary, but for any other game, I would consider no damage an importance, because no damage, when that game is actually designed for that kind of restriction, it means that it's really well designed. But there are just times with Resident Evil Revelations 2 where it really doesn't feel like the game was designed with no damage in mind, and it kind of turns the game into a tedious fest where you're just busy just replaying a section over and over again, just trying to get very consistent results. But Revelations 2 has a lot of problems, and there's a reason why I would consider this game to be one of my least favorite Resident Evil games. I mean, it's not as bad as like Resident Evil 1 Remake or Resident Evil 2 Remake, but it's definitely down that list for sure, because this game, both in gameplay, in character designs, and story, it leaves a lot to be desired. But the gameplay has definitely been improved a lot more compared to Revelations 1, even if there are some designs that Revelations 1 did a lot better than this game. But I'll elaborate on those points when I get the chance. So I've already explained why I'm doing no healing for this particular walkthrough, and I'm just glad to be doing an actual walkthrough of this game compared to that shitty pistol-only run I did when I was still under the guise of, oh, doing these kind of stupid runs actually makes you a cool player, because I unfortunately fell into a bad crowd, and I embraced those kind of runs like a fucking idiot. So I'm just glad to be delivering an actual walkthrough because of this. And in terms of a baseline walkthrough that actually has baseline restrictions that feel accommodating for this game, that is why I've opted to do a no healing walkthrough. And there were a couple of other reasons why I wanted to come back to this game after a very long time. Because Ether, in an absolutely incredulous statement, given how much we've been discussing Resident Evil Village, he made the most ridiculous claim I have ever heard from anyone by far about the Lycans from Resident Evil Village. And in a move that completely shook my world and just left me so flabbergasted, he said that the Afflicted in Resident Evil Revelations 2 are worse than the Lycans from Resident Evil Village. That right there is one of the most ridiculous claims I have ever heard, and that definitely served as incentive for me to do this walkthrough of Resident Evil Revelations 2. I mean, I agree that Revelations 2 is one of my least favorite Resident Evil games, and it's definitely a Resident Evil game that is not so functional in its designs. But come on! The Afflicted on this game have better designs than the Lycans from Resident Evil Village. At least there's the actual incentive to fight them in this game compared to Resident Evil Village, where that game is so confused with its mentalities because it flip-flops between Resident Evil 1 Remake mentalities, where you're just running past the enemies because they're poorly designed, and the actual combat systems that are a part of that game are not befitting for fighting any of those enemy types given the number of poor designs that they have. And that game is designed for knife only, and Resident Evil Village, in a really stupid move, tries to say it's designed for knife only. I mean, the thing is that Revelations 2 does say that Claire 1 is designed for knife only, or rather, just designed for melee weapons in general, and that is definitely true. I do agree with that. I mean, there are definitely a lot of parts to Claire 1 that are definitely designed for knife only, or melee weapons only. So I do agree with the developers about that decision, and that's definitely indicative of a developer that was at least comprehending their own designs on that department, but other mechanics with Revelations 2 definitely leave a lot to be desired, and you have to wonder what the developers were thinking. But going back to my main point, Resident Evil Village is confused with wanting to favor Resident Evil 1 Remake designs, compounded with Resident Evil 4 designs in terms of environment, in terms of combat scenarios, and it's just, the game is so fucking confused, and it delivers some very false messaging with its concept art and in the way the sections are presented, that level of confusion is worse than anything in Resident Evil Revelations 2. I mean, I might think differently when I actually get to certain parts of Revelations 2, but believe me, guys, with how much I have played Resident Evil Village, just analyzing that game in depth, and with how much I've actually played Revelations 2, and I've done that stupid pistol-only run, and I've actually played this game a couple of times, Revelations 2 doesn't feel as confused as Resident Evil Village in terms of enemy designs and in terms of like environmental designs, section designs. But I'm not saying that the enemy types are like really good, because they are pretty bad in this game, and I'll talk about them a lot when I actually get to those scenarios. But that won't be for a while, because Claire 1 is a pretty simple scenario right here, but I'm glad. I'm glad it's starting out very simple right now, just to help you get introduced to the mechanics. Whereas, like, Village, unfortunately, opts to favor that Village intro where you're just fighting a whole bunch of Lycans and you're having to just stumble through the mess that is that Village intro just to understand how the mechanics work, just to understand how the Lycans work, and eventually it just gets to a point where you're forced to sit behind a barricade just shooting the Lycans like crazy in the head, and they take so much punishment to actually die because the developers don't understand how to respect weaponry in survival horror games, and they don't understand how increasing the health of enemies causes more poor designs to actually show themselves. And look at this, by the way. We have just picked up the shotgun. The shotgun on this game actually knocks over enemies. In Resident Evil Village, the shotgun doesn't knock over enemies because they just completely lost all common sense with how to actually put in fundamental flinch animations that are complementary to the kind of sections that they actually favor in Resident Evil Village, and they just want to give the enemies an artificial handicap to just feign lethality, to somehow create this false sense of actual lethality, to actually make it seem like these are the ultimate BOWs. I mean, I wish they were the ultimate BOWs, I wish they were the most lethal enemy type ever, but for really stupid reasons like that, no, you can't say that with the Lycans on that game. The Lycans just cheat so much, and without flinch animations, they just gain all these properties and all these really stupid advantages that just force you to rely upon exploits, that force you to rely upon very unorthodox strategies. And admittedly, in Revelations 2, I do rely upon unorthodox strategies, but there's almost a case to be made that they aren't so unorthodox. Like, there are exploits that you can do in Claire 2 and Claire 3, where when you go through doors that trigger that unique animation where both Claire and Mara are going through the door, the enemies actually pause. But this only happens for very specific sections, so it could be an argument that because those exploits only occur for very specific sections, it's almost like the developers want you to use those exploits in order to save on your ammo and to get rid of the enemies, because the bosses on this game are damage sponges, and Revelations 2 has some of the worst bosses ever made in the entire Resident Evil series. And that's definitely one thing that Resident Evil Village does a lot better than Revelations 2. It's the bosses, even though certain bosses like Bella and Cassandra and Moreau and Aureus Strawhair, Aureus Drock. I mean, not Aureus Drock though. I'm not counting him because he's actually better designed than the other Aureus variants. Like, Resident Evil Village definitely has a lot of shitty bosses, but they aren't as shit as the bosses on this game, and there's definitely a workaround with those bosses on Resident Evil Village. And they do have some designs that can definitely balance them out, but at the same time, even when you're using those designs that do balance them out a bit, there are still those moments where they can fuck you because of really poor designs. And I don't need to explain any further the number of poor designs present with Resident Evil Village, because I've already made poor designs videos. I made 2 of them, and I still intend to continue that series of poor designs for Resident Evil Village. And I've talked so much about the poor designs. I've even shown them in my blind playthrough, and in my live streams, and in my walkthrough. Like, I've gone ad nauseum just talking about the poor designs on Resident Evil Village. And the poor designs in Resident Evil Village can feel just as bad as Revelations 2. Or at times, Revelations 2 can feel better designed than Resident Evil Village. And I really feel like Resident Evil Village, because it's a mainline Resident Evil title compared to Revelations 2, which is a side game, the criticisms have to be a lot more severe towards Resident Evil Village than with this game. But if I do find a part of Revelations 2 that definitely sparks some memories of just absolute misery, then I'll definitely bring them up when I get the chance. But we're not going to be encountering them for a while, because Claire 1 is pretty simple, as I've already mentioned. But I've already acknowledged why I'm doing a no healing walkthrough of Revelations 2, but you might be wondering why I'm doing survival difficulty, because this is not the highest difficulty of the game. No escape difficulty is the highest difficulty of the game, but that's not really a difficulty mode, because it feels very similar to survival difficulty, and you can only unlock it on New Game Plus. And I'm not going to be the kind of person where I'm just going to not slot into upgrades and just play through a very bare bones game on survival difficulty just to actually start at baseline with no escape difficulty. I'm not going to waste time with that, because it doesn't feel complementary to the designs that the developers wanted to go for with that difficulty. And at least with No Escape difficulty, it's clear that it's designed for New Game Plus if it's only unlocked on New Game Plus. And this game is designed with the upgrades in mind, only the upgrade system on this game doesn't feel as forced as Resident Evil Village. And in terms of how the upgrade system is presented on this game compared to Resident Evil Village, you can tell this game wants you to use the upgrades, and I'll gladly use the upgrades to flesh out the gameplay. I'm not going to be like Tynhard and just revel in bare-bones gameplay that does not fall into the realm of challenge. It falls into the realm of stupidity, and he's unfortunately so deluded enough to believe that doing very minimalist runs that don't even feel like minimalist runs, they feel like what the fuck runs, that just go far below the baseline way to actually play the game, and they don't complement the developers' designs whatsoever, and they fall far below the fundamental framework. It's like being naked in the snow and wondering why 1% of people just do that, and why more people don't do that when it just doesn't complement the biology of humans at all. Like, it's a very similar analogy to that case, where you're trying to do something that the game simply isn't designed for, and then you're trying to make it seem like it is designed because you want to act like an arrogant player, you want to put yourself above other people, you want to act like you're a fucking developer, and then you want to shut down people like me that are actually the more reasonable of the bunch. Yeah. That is exactly the kind of person I'll end up being if I choose to do survival difficulty with bare bones restrictions, just to actually start at baseline with No Escape difficulty. Like, I'm not going to make the gameplay look like shit, just to end up making the gameplay look better on No Escape difficulty, because that's not how the actual pacing of difficulty design works in this game. No, I'm going to do it on survival difficulty, which is the actual new game of Revelations 2, and not New Game Plus. That is what I'm going to do. And that is why I'm not wasting time with No Escape difficulty. And it doesn't even make any significant differences between survival difficulty and No Escape difficulty. No Escape difficulty just does no differences with survival difficulty, aside from increasing the enemy's health a bit. But you've already slotted into a lot of upgrades at that point, so what's the point? And also, it feels like with the difficulties for Revelations 2, they wanted to design this game with the challenges in mind, with those really silly restrictions like countdown mode or invisible enemy mode, where the game is defaulted to around like survival difficulty health, and they rearrange your inventory every time you start a new episode. And that's just what it feels like. It feels like they didn't want to take the difficulty design very seriously in this game compared to other games, because they wanted to favor those kind of difficulty modes, which aren't really difficulty modes, they're just silly runs. And that is why I'm also doing a survival difficulty, because of that reason, because I don't feel like the developers were serious enough with the difficulties on this game, so therefore I'm going to start a new game. So I'm pretty sure I've already established everything you need to know about why I'm doing survival difficulty and not No Escape difficulty. And why this time I'm actually doing a walkthrough rather than a stupid run like I did with my pistol-only run of this game on survival difficulty. But I've talked a lot about these points, but I guess I'll explain what we're doing right now. So we're just exploring the area, encountering the enemies. I'll explain a bit on the fundamentals of the combat system. So Revelations 2 doesn't favor a tank control-based system like Revelations 1. I mean, then again, it wasn't really a tank control-based system either in Revelations 1, but your movement is a lot more fluid on this game compared to Revelations 1. And on this game, you have a stamina penalty on your sprint, and you sprint a lot faster than you do in Resident Evil 6, I believe, but that stamina penalty causes you to be slower than in Resident Evil 6 in that sense. And the guns on this game, they definitely elicit better reactions on the enemies compared to Revelations 1, where that game was mainly about using the customization kits to actually do things that would have been possible in a non-customization kit game like Resident Evil 7, where you have to actually slot into a lot of power upgrades to really make the weapons feel on par with the guns in Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, 7. And that is what makes that game more so an RPG game. And the RPG designs of Revelations 1 forced you to rely upon certain weapons like the sniper rifle. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, though, because the sniper rifle in Revelations 1 is a lot of fun to use, and it's the most powerful weapon on that game. And it's needed to accommodate for how crappy the enemies can be at times with the really stupid scenarios that they put you in, like Episode 7. Episode 7 of Revelations 1. I was rewatching that part of my walkthrough, and it really is a shit part of the game. And when they're relying upon spawning enemies out of thin air, when they're just like throwing enemies at you like crazy, and they're just bum rushing you, and the stun animations just aren't very useful, and you instead have to rely upon the actual power of your sniper rifle, that just shows you have a problem with your fundamental designs. And the ooze on that game are really poor in their balancing, although people like Tynard will say, oh, we want to defend those enemy types to the ends of the earth. I believe he mentioned that to me when I said that the ooze were poorly balanced on that game, and that game is more about the RPG designs than anything else, but he disagreed with me. But you can't really trust a sadomasochist, and I say a sadomasochist because he mentioned that he likes to suffer when doing his so-called like silly runs or stupid runs. And yet he likes to embrace the smart tactic part of it when I really wonder what his definition of smart is, because the nuances involved with understanding what constitutes smart gameplay, he doesn't understand. But yeah, he's loopy in the brain, basically. And that's why I can't really take a lot of his words at face value properly. But anyway, going back to my main tangent, Revelations 1 definitely had some things that Revelations 2 improved upon, but Revelations 1 also had designs that Revelations 2 didn't improve upon and instead were inferior to Revelations 1. But at the moment, with Claire 1, Revelations 1 doesn't feel as good as Revelations 2. But I mentioned that the movement on this game is a lot more fluid. You can actually run at right angles before the camera shifts back to facing in your direction. And also on this game, you have the ability to do a button-prompted dodge, where you press circle and you move the analog stick in a certain direction, and your character will actually jump to that direction, and they will do a dodge. On Revelations 1, the dodge was context-sensitive, where you had to move the left analog stick forward, or you had to do a quick turn at the right moment, so that the enemy didn't hit you, but the detection on the actual dodge on that game is horrible, and that's why the dodge in Revelations 1 is the worst dodge system I have ever used in all of the Resident Evil games. And then some of my former friends will say that, oh, it's actually intentional for the dodge to have very poor detection so that it complements the Shadow Dancer ability from Raid mode, when that has to be one of the stupidest forms of argument I have ever heard for actually trying to defend the dodge system in Revelations 1 by saying that it should be hindered by an upgrade to actually make it on par with that of a properly functional dodge system. Does that really sound rational? No, it doesn't. And that's why the dodge system in Revelations 1 is not as good as the dodge system from Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's not as good as the dodge system from Resident Evil 6. It's not as good as the dodge system from Resident Evil 7. Yeah, that is a very crappy dodge system in Revelations 1. And the dodge system in Revelations 2 is a lot better, but it's still not that reliable of a dodge system because there are a lot of attacks that the enemies do on this game that give them so much forward momentum, and they run so fast that they can bypass the actual length provided by the dodge. And that is what makes the dodge system so unreliable in a lot of parts of Revelations 2, at least based on my memory. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe I was playing the game differently back then. That was likely inferior, but I doubt it. I'll have to see when I get to those next episodes. But a lot of the times in Revelations 2, you're going to be putting yourself in a position where you don't have to dodge. You'll be relying upon spacing, you'll be relying upon running away, and you'll be relying upon exploits. And I think you'll notice this a lot more when you encounter the bosses on this game. And I already mentioned that the bosses on this game are some of the worst bosses ever made in the entire Resident Evil series. And I mean that. Like, all of them are shit. There isn't really a good boss fight on this game because they're damage spongy. They gain all of these properties that just allow them to cheat. And they have no creativity to them whatsoever. They're just like mindless boss fights. I mean, look at Alex Wesker. Alex Wesker is the perfect personification of this mentality because she is a damage spongy final boss. She has no creativity to her. Her feedback systems are very ambiguous, and at times she'll just do attacks that can be very bullshit. And it just constitutes a what the fuck were they doing boss fight, basically. And it's the same case with a lot of the other bosses. And they're just boring. They're really boring. They spend more time than necessary actually being bosses. There's no sense of pacing to them. They drag out for a while, and even with the upgrades, they can take a while to do. And they just feel very awkward to fight. I mean, look at, like, Pedro, for instance, when you're fighting him as Barry. Look how much of a waiting game you have to play, and then you're juggling with the AI all the time, because even when you're telling the AI to wait, they move all over the place just to either adjust themselves in relation to a boss or an enemy, or they just do it because they're ignoring your commands. And, like, with how limited the command prompts are, with just causing your AI partner to follow you or just wait, you would assume they would devote better time to ensuring that those commands actually work, but a lot of the times, the commands just don't work very well, just like Resident Evil 6. And there are times where you're trying to tell your AI partner to follow you or wait, and they don't register your command, they decline. And also, even when you're telling them to wait and they are waiting, they still move around like crazy. And when they're following you, they can be very slow at times to even sprint towards where you are. And it's just a badly designed AI system in this game, and there's a reason why they made it where the AI has the ability to regain health. And when I'm talking about the AI, I'm specifically referring to Moira and Natalia. Those are the only characters that regenerate their health. And originally, when I was thinking of the possibility of doing a no damage walkthrough, I considered doing no damage only for the main characters. With the side characters, they could take as much punishment as they wanted because they just regenerated health. But although Ether acknowledged that they don't fully regenerate their health, they only regenerate their health up to a certain threshold. And while that is true, that's irrelevant to the point I'm trying to say right here, that even wasting time just trying to make sure your AI partner isn't taking damage for a no damage walkthrough, would it really be much of a walkthrough if you're just juggling your AI partner all over the place? And it's not like it's that much of a consequence because when the AI goes down, they go into a state where you need to revive them. And I don't know if the AI actually dies out if they're in that dying state for too long. I don't know. But every single time they have never died out and I've been able to revive them. And it's great as well because for a survival horror game, you should never be juggling an AI partner around like that. Like with Evil Within, for instance, where playing with Joseph in Chapter 5 and in Chapter 6, the fact that he could die and his AI wasn't properly designed, that really led to a lot of frustration, and it just took you out of the survival horror environment that you were in with the Evil Within. And it wasn't until Chapter 12 where they realized that giving Joseph a health bar was stupid, and so they made it where he could not die in Chapter 12. And then in Evil Within 2, they made improvements to the AI where, aside from Sykes, Torres had a health bar, and when she lost all her health, she didn't die out. She went into a revive state where you need to revive her. And it takes a while, and you can't heal her before that point, which is one of the main downsides to the AI in Evil Within 2, although I find for the most part the AI in the Evil Within 2, they serve more so for the purpose of distracting enemies than actually being useful. And at times, even when they're distracting enemies, it led to a lot of problems with actually doing the sections. Like Chapter 10 was very difficult. It's the hardest chapter in the Evil Within 2. And I flip-flop between whether I should keep the AI around or just leaving them in the dying state. But I haven't come to a clear consensus as to what I should do. But regardless, the AI in the Evil Within 2 is designed in a way that doesn't affect your immersion into the survival horror environment. Whereas in the case of Evil Within 1 with Chapter 5 and in Chapter 6, that was different. And with Revelations 2, unfortunately, the AI can be so much of a burden on the same levels as Joseph from Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 from the Evil Within 1 that why would you ever want to waste time trying to make sure they aren't taking any damage when they can at least regenerate their health up to that threshold? And it's not like they make up a significant gameplay component, aside from these kind of situations in Claire 1, where I'm using Moira to actually damage enemies, and she's regenerating her life, and she's using her crowbar. She doesn't use ammo in the slightest. Aside from those moments, the AI doesn't really make up a significant percentage of the gameplay that you're actually doing. So that's why they're negligible in a no-damage walkthrough, in my opinion, although Ether might disagree with me on that, but he'd be crazy to do a no-damage walkthrough and just trying to keep his AI partner from taking any damage. But I just feel in that sense, you're not delivering a walkthrough that's hard. Actually doing the walkthrough isn't hard, it's tedious. That's what it is. And if a walkthrough is going to be hard to make rather than tedious to make, and it's purely based upon the actual difficulty of the game for actually the right reasons, I'll gladly do that, not vice versa. But I feel like at times Ether can be a little insane with some of his runs. But I'll not talk about Ether right now, even though his comment about the Afflicted being worse than the Lycans. I mean, look at this section right here. They give you an environmental trap to use against the enemies and not waste time using the fire trap, because if you use the fire trap, you'll affect Barry's path, and that's a design that they wanted to go for in Revelations 2, where your actions in the past, and Claire's campaign takes place in the past, Barry's campaign takes place in the present, but your actions in Claire's campaign can actually affect Barry's campaign. And it's an interesting idea, but I just feel like the game sets up the scenarios in a way where it's just better to pick one scenario rather than the other. They don't make both scenarios equally manageable. They make one path a lot better than the other path. And it just defeats any incentive to partake in that whole system. And it's the same case with the scenario design in Resident Evil 3. in the original version of Resident Evil 3, it was always better to take one specific path when you were picking a live selection rather than favoring another path, because the other path would often present with problems when doing a no damage walkthrough of that game or a speed run. So I don't care that they removed the live selection system in Resident Evil 3 Remake, because in all honesty, guys, I just kind of felt that the live selection system from Resident Evil 3 was entirely superfluous. And at times it can feel superfluous with the live selection system in Resident Evil Revelations 2. But I still like the fact that they went for that idea. But the main point I was getting on before diverting off on this tangent was that the Afflicted are nowhere near as bad as the Lycans. I don't know why Ether feels as such. I don't really know what his reasons are. I hope he comments on this walkthrough and he actually details his reasons with better clarity, because there is no way in hell the Lycans are actually better designed than the Afflicted. There is no possible way. And given the way that the mechanics work in this game, there is no possible way you're going to put yourself in a situation where the Afflicted are actually worse than the Lycans. And also, with the way the upgrade system works in Revelations 2, where it doesn't present itself in a false format. Like, in Resident Evil Village, the merchant system presents as this optional feature, but in actuality, based on the way Resident Evil Village is balanced on hardcore difficulty and Village of Shadows difficulty, where a lot of the fundamental mechanics are just tied to the merchant system, and your crafting resources are tied to the merchant system, and you're just buying ammo from the merchant system because a lot of the enemies are damage sponges and the bosses are damage sponges, and trying to play that game without the merchant system feels like you're on a ball and chain, and that should never be the case with survival horror games. That's what I mean when I say Resident Evil Village favors a false model, whereas in Resident Evil Revelations 2, when you beat an episode, you get pulled to the upgrade screen. I mean, they don't force you into it, but the fact that they even bother putting up the upgrade screen to give you the chance to actually pick your skills shows that they wanted you to actually favor the upgrades on this game. And that's what I'm doing right here, to actually flesh out the gameplay, because you do gain access to new abilities through the upgrade system. This is not like you're augmenting fundamental designs, you're actually gaining access to new abilities. And any kind of upgrade system that is built around that foundation, you need to slot into that to make the gameplay interesting and not favor bare bones designs. Like every single game that favors this model, the upgrade system actually feels accommodating for the game. But with Resident Evil Village, that's not the case, and it's so forced in Resident Evil Village through a false model, and it's really bad messaging on Capcom's part. Or shall I say, new Capcom's part. And I'm not too sure what I should call the team that made Revelations 2, given that it's one of my least favorite Resident Evil games, and it really shows in a lot of the objective problems that Revelations 2 has. But maybe I should call this team Confused Capcom rather than Outdated Capcom, because Outdated Capcom is the one that designed the games before Resident Evil 4, and I'm sure members of Outdated Capcom joined New Capcom, and maybe elements of Confused Capcom actually joined New Capcom to create New Capcom, the shitty development team that made Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, and they botched up Resident Evil Village, which I was so hoping would be a masterpiece of a game. But expect to hear a lot of comparisons between this game and Resident Evil Village, because Resident Evil Village really comes across as being a Revelations 3, and I know there are rumors that Village was actually Revelations 3 at one point, but Polkit Sharma, one of my subscribers, said that these rumors were not true, but it still comes across as such with Resident Evil Village, and that's why this comparison has to be made throughout this walkthrough. But that is the end of Claire 1. Stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.